Well, hello, brothers and sisters. It is so wonderful to be with you again today. Of course, this is Readings with Regina, and I am Dr. Regina Jennings. And this series, as most of you know, but I know I have some new subscribers, this series is created to help our people to learn more about our history that may or may not be taught in regular schools. And I'm talking about from junior high to high school to even colleges and universities. And I want to remind everybody again that this is the month of Huey P. Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party. His birthday is on February the 17th. Now, I am a 17th sister too. My birthday is June 17th. And my good sister Katera is here today, and she's a 17th too. So I think it is something quite remarkable in being a 17th person. That is, you're born on the 17th day. But actually, all the days of the month are special. And I want all of you, honestly, to realize that you didn't come to this planet just to live, just to eat, look at TV, talk trash with friends. You came to this planet to make it better. I absolutely believe that. And there are spiritual traditions that back up what I am saying. So I want you to just keep in mind as I read to you how very special you are and what a pleasure it is that we are on the earth at the same time. Now I'm going to be reading again from the book. Let me find the book for you. The Half That Was Never Told. I want to see if I can find the book just to show it to you again. Here it is. The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward Baptiste. And this chapter that I'm going to read from, it's the first chapter. And I want to remind you that this chapter is called Feet. All right, let me try to get this out the way. There, that's great. Okay, go back to that. Here we go. Now, again, this chapter is called Feet. In early 1792, Virginia enslaver John Breckinridge was worried. He owned considerable land across the mountains in Kentucky. He knew that over there was sitting a convention tasked with writing a constitution that would enable Kentucky to emerge from its territorial chrysalis and become a separate state of the Union. And he had heard that in the convention might have the same doubts that Thomas Jefferson and George Mason had. Breckinridge had no such doubts. He once advised a female relative, quote, "Your land and Negroes, let no person on this earth persuade you to give them up," end of quote. She wouldn't, however, be forced to do that by federal decision. After the 1789 ratification of the United States Constitution, the first Congress gathered in New York and immediately began to try to stabilize the chaotic territories. Congress confirmed the Northwest Ordinance's ban on slavery in what would eventually become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. No one thought those areas would make the commodities that John Rutledge had promised back at the Philadelphia Convention. South of the Ohio, the new Congress left open a massive new region for enslavers, organizing the Tennessee Territory in 1790 by passing a Southwest ordinance that was an exact copy of the Northwest one, except that it left out the clause banning slavery. In the Natchez District along the Mississippi, slaves were already growing massive quantities of indigo. And in Kentucky, the first national census in 1790 had counted 61,000 whites and more than 12,000 enslaved Africans. Kentucky was not becoming Jefferson's dream republic of land-owning white yeomen, especially since the territory's constitutional convention decided that all land disputes would be referred to a statewide court of appeals staffed by 3 elite judges. The 21 speculators who owned a full quarter of all Kentucky land surely approved. Meanwhile, convention delegate David Rice, both a slaveholder, oh my God, I gotta read this. Convention delegate David Rice, both a slaveholder and a Presbyterian minister. I want to say that again. David Rice, a delegate at the convention, a slaveholder, and a Presbyterian minister, told the convention that slavery inevitably produced theft, kidnapping, and rape. Now, I wonder how he, as a slaveholder, knew that. Although a given owner might be a good man, he went on to say, debts could force him to break up families. Rice also insisted that slavery weakened the new republic by incorporating a group of people against whom citizens had effectively declared war. So understand that this enslaver, this Presbyterian minister, knew that slavery was war on the African people that had become the Negroes. Okay. But the other delegates rejected his emancipation proposal, concluding that slavery actually strengthened Kentucky because it attracted wealthy settlers who would buy land from speculators. Once he heard the good news, John Breckinridge prepared to move his slaves west across the mountains. He wasn't sure if he would avoid, quote, the perplexity of a plantation, end of quote, by hiring out his slaves. You see, slaves were hired out, and the money that they made was given to the master, certainly not to the slave. So the master, he could make, double, triple, whatever off of one slave. He already owned him. The slave was doing work for the master, but he could also lend him out to other people for payment. He'd heard, this is John Breckinridge, that in the labor-hungry West, the hire of your Negroes and rent of your land will far exceed any annual income you ever enjoyed. Reluctant, now check this out, reluctant to do the job himself, he convinced his neighbor, John Thompson, to lead the Breckinridge slaves across the mountains to his Kentucky properties. By the morning of April 3rd, Thompson was at Fluvanna County on the James River, ready to leave with Breckinridge's 18 enslaved people in tow. Francis Frederick remembered such a morning on which he too had begun a forced march to Kentucky. As those who were about to be led away formed up before dawn, he saw men and women fall on the damp ground behind the old I-style house, on their knees, begging to be purchased, to go with their wives or husbands. Some were abroad husbands, men owned by other enslavers, but who had been allowed Saturday night visits with their wives, and who were now watching the dawn end their marriages. Some were abroad wives who had risen at 3 a.m. to walk to the plantation, bringing the last change of clothes they would ever wash for their husbands. Holding the hands of parents who were staying, were sobbing sons and daughters. Begging was of no avail, remembered Frederick. The man guiding the slaves out to Kentucky, well, this was not his first time. When he was ready, off they went, walking down the road toward the Blue Ridge looming in the distance. They walked, indeed, for as long as John Breckinridge owned people on both sides of the mountain. He also owned the connections between them. He held the carrots and he held the sticks. For instance, Breckinridge had inherited a man named Bill from his father-in-law, Joseph Cabell. Breckinridge decided that Bill would have to go to the Kentucky farms. So would Bill's sister, Sarah. This was when Bill and Sarah's mother, Violet, went to her owner, Mary Cabell, Breckinridge's mother-in-law. Don't let Sarah go to Kentucky, Violet begged. Not unless Stephen, her husband, owned by another enslaver, could go with them. Violet had Mary Cabell's ear. However, Stephen cost more money than Breckinridge wanted to spend. Keeping Sarah in Virginia was the way for Breckinridge to save himself grief in his own family. So Sarah stayed. But Bill marched up the wilderness road, knowing that if he ran away along the trail, all bets were off. Sarah and any children she might have would be gone from Violet's life. The best he could do was to make the utilitarian calculations of the unfree. So he traded himself for his sister's marriage and his mother's last years. So you can see how, in fact, slavery was in the families. Slavery was bequeathed to people. Slavery was traded within in-laws and biological members of a family. This was America in 1787. And I also want to even reiterate what they called abroad slaves. That is, a wife might live on one plantation, but her husband might live further on down the road, way down the road, to another plantation. And sometimes these masters would allow their husband and wife slaves to visit each other, but it would have to be like 3 o'clock in the morning after all of their work was done, where the wife or the husband would walk to the next plantation to see their loved one. But when the master or mistress wanted to sell any slave, he or she could. Whether those slaves were married, whether those slaves were brother and sister or mother, this is the origination of enslavement in 1787. I want to read to you now from a book that many of you are following me with. This is Murder Incorporated by Mumia. And I do hope most of you in my audience know about the plight of Mumia Abu Jamal. And if you don't, I encourage you to look him up on the internet. Mumia Abu Jamal, one of the greatest activists and writers of our time. So I want to tell you about another enslaved man, quite different from the ones that you just heard about. This chapter, I'm on page 178 in Murder Incorporated, and this is called Black Pioneer. Now, again, all of these passages that I'm reading, the previous one was like 10 years after the Revolution, the American Revolution, 1776. This one is during the actual 1776 American Revolution. And this is called Black Pioneer. Despite the victories and losses of war, such events can sometimes push certain individuals into action, and furthermore, their lives give insight into the shared experiences of the many. Nearly lost in the shifting sands of history was one such man, Thomas Peters. Born in the Yoruba regions of Nigeria to an Igbo clan, Peters was captured in 1760 in the transatlantic slave industry. And I like that the writer, Stephen M. Omea, wrote transatlantic slave industry because it was an industry. It was a booming, big, capitalistic business. It was on board a French slaving vessel. I have told you before, it wasn't just the English that were enslavers. It was the Spanish, and now you see it also was the French. It was also the Portuguese, but I just wanted to point out that we're talking about a French slaver, a vessel that he was brought to port in New Orleans. He was made captive, but he was never mentally enslaved. This is important too. This is very important. Because when generations began among the Africans in the Americas, many of the African Americans, or those called Negroes at the time, did become mentally enslaved. They did. Now, this brother, Peters, Thomas Peters, did not. For his thirst for freedom spurred him ever onward to the natural right of liberty. For Peters, this didn't mean those rights boasted of by the European tribes, whose treaties and constitutions promise one thing but deliver quite another. He meant liberty, true liberty, freedom. 3 times he escaped while in Louisiana, and 3 times he was recaptured. He suffered greatly for such prison breaks. He was whipped severely, thereafter branded, branded with a hot iron, branded, and finally had ankle shackles fitted about him. His continued resistance wore out the French enslaver who sold him to another in a land north of Louisiana. Peters, now living in bondage in Wilmington, North Carolina, on the Cape Fear River, continued his efforts to be free. Here, he is thought to have acquired his skills as a millwright, that's one who works on mills or builds them, and machinery of such structure. For Wilmington was a port city, and more than 3/5 of the African captive population in Cape Fear worked in the timber industry or naval stores. They worked as stevedores, sawyers, carpenters, tar burners, or carters. These people kept Cape Fear's economy thriving. I'm gonna stop here. I'm going to read more about Thomas Peters the next time that we meet. But I want you to notice right now the kind of skills that he was picking up as an enslaved man. And he was more than likely lent out as well to double or triple the money that his new owner would make from having purchased him as an enslaved man. Now, we have to go to Brother Fred. We must go to Brother Fred. And I so appreciate you, especially the good sister, I think her name is Joan. She went to the library and got a copy of the narrative of Frederick Douglass. Okay? And that is a very smart thing to do. Libraries are here for you. They're free. And you can get any book pretty much any book that you want. Own it for a while for free. Libraries are marvelous. In fact, it was Ben Franklin of Philadelphia who started the library in Philadelphia. All right. So I'm on page 41, but this is chapter 3, because those of you who might be reading along with me, your edition of Frederick Douglass's book certainly couldn't possibly look like my old chestnut here. This is from the 1980s. But I am on chapter 3, and I'm at the very bottom of the page that begins with this. This is Frederick Douglass, his narrative. To describe the wealth of Colonel Lloyd would be almost equal to describing the riches of Job. He kept from 10 to 15 house servants. He was said to own 1,000 slaves, and I think this estimate quite within the truth. Colonel Lloyd owned so many that he did not know them when he saw them, nor did all the slaves of the out farms know him. It is reported of him that while riding along the road one day, he met a colored man and addressed him in the usual manner of speaking to colored people on the public highway of the South. Quote, "Well, boy, whom do you belong to?" End of quote. The enslaved African said, "To Colonel Lloyd." Colonel Lloyd says, "Well, what does the colonel treat you? Does he treat you well?" "Oh, no, sir," was the ready reply. "What does he work you? Too hard?" "Oh, yes, sir." "Well, don't he give you enough to eat?" "Yes, sir. He gives me enough to eat, such as it is." The colonel, after ascertaining where the slave belonged, rode on. The man also went on about his business, not dreaming that he had been conversing with his master. He thought, said, and heard nothing more of the matter until 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. The poor man was then informed by his overseer that for having found fault with his master, he was now to be sold to a Georgia trader. The enslaved people never wanted to go to Georgia, so this was quite a punishment. He was immediately chained and handcuffed, and thus, without a moment's warning, he was snatched away and forever sundered from his family and friends by a hand more unrelenting than death. This is the penalty of telling the truth, of telling the simple truth in answer to a series of plain questions. It is partly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired of as to their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally say they are contented and that their masters are kind. The slaveholders have been known to send in spies among the slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. The frequency of this has had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and in so doing, prove themselves a part of the human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untried man. I have been frequently asked, when a slave, if I had a kind master, and do not remember ever to have given a negative answer. Nor did I, in pursuing this course, consider myself as uttering what was absolutely false. For I always measured the kindness of my master by the standard of kindness set up among slaveholders around us. Moreover, slaves are like other people and imbibe prejudices quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves. And this, too, in some cases, when the very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not uncommon for slaves even to fall out and quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters, each contending for the superior goodness of his own over that of the others. This is what I was alluding to earlier when I mentioned that there were some enslaved people that were so ingrained and so dehumanized by the position of being owned by white folk that, in fact, they took on the psychology, if you will, of the master. And in fact, they would pit one among themselves now. They would pit one master against another. Like I might say, well, my master, he better than your master. And then Katera might say, oh no, my master is really the one that's good. So this kind of behavior, this kind of psychology developed early in the generations that evolved from the enslaved African in the Americas. In short, Black people, Negroes then, had to develop a way that they could survive under this tyranny, under this war against them. So they developed all kinds of behaviors that would enable them to live another day. And we who are here today, we got to be actually thankful for that, because we would not be here. Many of us would not be here if it wasn't for the kind of internal behaviors that our enslaved ancestors developed under the war against them that was slavery. And I also want to remind you of one more thing. When I talked about the slaves that John Breckinridge owned and they were marched across the mountains in Kentucky, understand that they were shackled from the shoulders and often shackled around the ankles. So they had to move like this. While the enslaver, he'd be on a horse. Those were called slave coffles. And you can look that up as well. Now, in leaving you today, I want to remind you that I really want you to share these videos with your children. Share them with your parents. And certainly you who are watching this, spread the word. This is key, because now I'm talking about contemporary Black people. We should have a Saturday school. I don't care what schools your children go to. You might consider them some of the best schools in this country. Okay, cool. But most of the schools will not go into the kind of depth that those of us of African descent need to know about. And I'll even say this to you too. Quiz your children, be a parent. Quiz them. You don't have to grade them, but quiz them. Okay? Any words that I say from these books that you don't know or they don't know, have them look up that word. Write it out, write out its meaning. This, of course, will build their vocabulary. Well, brothers and sisters, it's always a pleasure to be with you, and know that you are prayed for morning and night by me. You are special. All of us on this planet are, and I don't take that lightly. So I will see you next Tuesday, and we shall continue our conversation. And in the meantime, in between time, you take good care.